Hello friends, so we are in the middle of the discussion on Turgenev, and Professor Payal Nagpal has covered one story by him, Rendezvous, and in that story, which is a real short story, she has pointed out the details which are interesting and also significant. And they tell us about the society of the time, and they also talk about the higher taste that the characters captured in the story also exhibit. So we look forward to reading her analysis and her comment on the second short story that she has picked up for sharing her views on with us. So without any more, ado, I request her to begin the second story, and we are all ears.
Yes. So I'll just kind of also close in on the first one, in the last part, exactly what happens. So the narrator here is, the dispassionate observer who's very angry at what he sees. And Akulina continues to ask, him for some kind of attention and says that, if you would just say one word. But he has this high-handed attitude and he says that, well, to pass the winter in the country is nasty. He's not going to stay on. He says, it's almost as if he has these airs about him that he's working for this rich person. So he says that, well, St. Petersburg is different. There are such wonders that you could not imagine in your dreams. You silly, what houses, what streets, society, education, it's something wonderful. And Akulina keeps listening. But, he says that, I'm saying all this to you, you cannot understand it. And so she says, now at this point, Akulina gets very angry. And she says, you did not speak to me like this before, Victor Alexandrovich. And she said without lifting her eyes. Now this is a very firm statement that comes from Akulina. She says that, this is not the way that he had spoken to her earlier, because the assumption is that earlier he must be wooing her and was being kind to her. But now that he is leaving her, he's being very, very rude to her. So, I'm not angry, only you are foolish. What do you want? He says, I can't marry you, is, what he says. And she says that, well, she doesn't want anything at all. She only wanted him to, state his love for her, and he refuses to do that. And a very important question that connects us, really speaking, to the next story is that she asks is, what will become of me? Wretched one that I am, they'll marry the poor little orphan off to a man she does not like. My poor little head. So the head thinks, and she thinks about her life. She had thought that she might marry somebody she likes, but she's a poor little orphan, and she will be married off to just about anyone. And at this point, the narrator, of course, he's standing there to her side, and he just wants to rush to Akulina. And but before he even reaches there, she leaves, and he feels very sad about it. And he really speaking wants to provide comfort, and he says, I began to feel sad, and it's almost as if the winter was approaching. And suddenly, so he says that somebody rode by beyond the bare hillock, making noise with an empty wagon, and he returned home. But he says the image, and this is how the story ends, the image of poor Akulina did not leave my mind for a long time, and the cornflowers, the ones that she was holding, long withered, are in my possession to this day.
So there is a kind of reconciliation?
There is no reconciliation. So this is the narrator who carries that moment within him, as probably does the writer. Maybe he had actually witnessed the scene or heard about it, and he writes about it. But the story, the rendezvous, the meeting, draws attention to the fineness of somebody like Akulina, and to the very, very brusque behavior of the man who's no longer wooing her. And the question that she raises at the end, what is going to become of her? She's a poor woman. This consciousness of a woman belonging to the ordinary class, what's going to become of her? Now, this is a question that's taken up in the next story, which is called A Correspondence, which is in the form of letters. So there are about these 15 letters that the story is on. So I'd just move on to that. So here, in the introduction to this particular story, it's the personal recollections that are, kind of kept here. The story has a prominent interest for readers since it narrates an actual fact in his life without the slightest, coloring. And Turgenev is commended for this very, very objective description of whatever he has probably seen or heard or, kind of experienced. So, now, in this story, which is in the form of letters, these are 15 letters, again, we have three people here. The two people who are writing letters to each other, and the third is the person who has all these letters in his possession. And he decides to publish these letters. So just like the Rendezvous, where there were three characters, we had the young girl, the man, and the narrator. Similarly here, we have the letters and we have the narrator. So the narrator who's, with the man here, the male protagonist, and this man has died and he has left everything in his possession. So here too, it is extremely objective, and we have the narrator who says that he got to know about this Russian man who is not well. So he goes to meet him and tells him that each time he tells him to get medical help and so on, he just puts him off and says that he's not really going to survive. So this man, that is Alexei Petrovich, says that he requested me to send all his things to Russia to his relatives, with the exception of a small packet which he presented to me as a souvenir. And this was a packet that contained letters of a young girl to Alexei and his letters to her. And these are 15 letters, and he says that usually the letters are love letters, are generally between two people, but here it's kind of presented to him. Now the story here is, and in fact lack of story that we see here, is that there are these four people. So Alexei is there, and who had a cousin, and there's Maria, the girl to whom he's writing, who also had a sister. And Alexei was to probably be engaged to Maria's sister, and Maria was to be engaged to Alexei's cousin. But both relationships don't work out, and they don't get married. And Alexei, at a much later stage, is writing letters to Maria. Now, through this correspondence, a lot of questions about what is love, about the condition of women, these are some of the questions that are raised. And the final letters, of course, are about how Maria writes to Alexei saying that he has not responded to her. But he finally writes one last letter telling her that he's about to die. And finally, the letters, of course, are what the narrator has in his possession. So here, he says that the narrator says he's decided to publish this correspondence, and he hopes for indulgence on the part of the reader, because these are not love letters, he says. God forbid. Love letters are generally read by two persons only. But on the other hand, 1,000 times in succession, and they are intolerable, if not ridiculous, to a third person. So he says that, these are not, there is something to kind of, take away. So it's referred to as a short story, but as I said that, there is no plot in that sense. What we know is that there were these relationships which didn't materialize, and we have a correspondence. And the correspondence begins in a very interesting manner. So, where Alexei Petrovich writes to Maria and says that, he's got to know that her relationship has not worked out. And so he says that, he avoids solemn speeches and intimate effusions and so on. And he has this momentary impulse. And he says that he's not trying to console her, but he wants to have some kind of correspondence with her, to understand what she's going through. So he says, I understand sincere, warm sympathy, but this is not to be got from everyone. So he says that, well, if you don't want to respond, fine. But he says, what I do want you to kind of, continue this correspondence. And so he says, but what right have I to write to you, to talk about my friendship, my feelings, about consolation? None whatever. Positively none. And he says, I'm bound to admit that, and I rely solely upon your kindness. So Maria has to, and he finally says that, if you were to just write one word, yes, so that this correspondence could continue. So in one of the letters, she just writes one line saying yes. So here, again, I would request Professor Prakash to also comment on this form. It's interesting because, we in the 18th century, we have novels in the form of letters. The epistolary form is there. And here, Turgenev, who's written sportsman sketches, many short stories, in this he kind of uses the form of
No,
letters.
this is once again very evocative. When you write a letter, then you are in the middle of the experience, and then the letter comes to an end, and then it is left somewhere. So in a way, the writer gets cut off from his own document, and the other person gets the document, he or she reads it, and then it goes away again. So the story doesn't continue.
Yes.
There is always a break after the letter. And particularly when the person has died and he left those letters with another person who is reading them, as if these things may have happened, they may not have happened. So it's a very fine form, and here you have a kind of beginning, an end, a continuation. But I was struck mainly by the way you interpreted the title correspondence indirectly, because correspondence means there are two people and they respond to each other.
Yes.
And that response is sometimes expected and sometimes dreaded. And the person would say at the end, that he would die, and after that there's no letter. So correspondence in the actual sense of the word, that you respond and you don't respond, and there are two people, and both of them are expecting something from each other. So it's a very subtle thing that is there in the story, and lots of questions are raised in it.
Yes.
There's a woman, there's a man, there's a third person. He's a viewer, he's a critic, and well, all three capture the reality of their time. So I'm really fascinated by the use of the letter form in this particular way.
And in fact, like the short story, The Rendezvous, a correspondence also kind of presents the women and the men in a certain way and raises questions about the way they exist in Russian society in the 19th century. So here too, and there is wit also. So Maria is not quite pleased about the letter that she receives, and she says that the letter has produced what she calls an unpleasant impression on her. And she replies, she says that in reply to your idle chatter, as you put it, she says she wants to ask a question: to what end? Her question is, what is the point of this correspondence? Why should she? She was not engaged to him; it was it was his cousin. So why should she hold any correspondence, so to say, with this person? So and she asks, that what have you got to do with me, and what have I got to do with you? So she says, I'm grateful for sympathy, but she says, well, we are strangers to each other, and I feel not the slightest desire to become intimate with anyone whatsoever. And she's not quite happy about it. But finally, once she agrees, then he begins to talk about different things. It's love, it's about life. What is it that gives you happiness? So, he asks, were not we in love with each other? Was not happiness so near, so possible? And I have immediately asked you, he says, why have not we gained the shore we longed for? Because falsehood was walking hand in hand with us, and it was poisoning our best sentiments. So what, really speaking, the question that he's asking is, does love mean, really speaking to Maria? What did it mean to him? And what were the sentiments that actually killed it? And the fact that they tried to love and it didn't work out.
What is your answer to these questions?
I think actually just the raising of the question here is significant, but the answer I think that Maria gives is more important, which is, she straight away asks him, do you know what it means to be a Russian woman?
Of
And
course he
she
doesn't.
elaborates.
Yes, yes.
And she elaborates, and she talks about it, and she then, kind of, the moment you start thinking, so she says that because she's a thinking woman, so then people around her are, in a very pejorative way, calling her a female philosopher and so on. So And of course, even at the end of it, Alexei tries to uphold the whole idea of nature and nurture in women, because obviously we are still talking about mid-19th century Russia. This correspondence is dated around 1840, in fact.
In fact, the
So,
woman is also drawing a line, that she
yes,
is a woman and
yes.
she has her own selfhood and she wants to understand love. Maybe the kind of thing that he conveys to her is not love, or maybe it is, but the question is raised.
The question is raised.
Mm.
So he says that, well, it's time to end this long letter, and he says that she says, Maria's response is very interesting. After this particular long letter about love and what it means, she says, do you know what your letter has aroused in me? So, one might think it might be compassion and sympathy or love. She says indignation. Yes, she says indignation. And I will immediately explain to you why it aroused this feeling, she says. And here is the question, which is why, I felt that this relates directly to the question that is posed by Akulina in the Rendezvous. That, what is to become of me? So here too, Maria asks, in a sense, both cases are of abandoned women, but both women belong to totally two different social classes. One from the, ordinary peasantry, and here Maria is, of course, much better off. So she asks, she says, you are a clever man. Have you ever asked yourself what sort of a creature a Russian woman is? What is her fate, her position in the world? In short, what her life is like. I think this story is valuable for this particular section in this correspondence, where Maria is posing this particular question to the reader, to the narrator, to all of us.
Professor Payal Nagpal, you have very very cleverly brought the two stories together, and one leaves somewhere the woman, but the woman rejoins in the other story, and their gap of social type doesn't come in the way, because finally they are women.
They are women.
And as women, they are not satisfied.
Yes.
They are angry,
Yes.
and then the word indignation is important in that case, and she has to say it. So that way, the gender divide, the class divide, etc., gets the women together. And it's the women against men.
Yes.
Because men or take things for granted, and women are not happy with that.
Yes, and we must remember, we are talking about a world in which serfdom has not been, it is going to be abolished, but it's still there. And at the same time, so, the options that women had, and then women from the peasantry, the options were very, very limited. And if we say that whether it's the Rendezvous or whether it's a correspondence, Turgenev is not giving any answers, because there aren't any at that particular time. And what's interesting is his delineation of these women as thinking women, where she doesn't say my emotions, Akulina doesn't say my emotions or her body, she talks about her head. She says my head. And I think that is very important. And here, this is extremely insightful. It is a very long letter, this particular one, where Maria Alexandrovna raises the question about women. She says, I do not know whether you have ever had time to put that question to yourself. As a man, you've never thought about it. And she says, I really don't know how you're going to answer it. But she says that, she will try and talk about it. So, she says, surely you will agree that, women at all events who are not satisfied with ordinary cares of domestic life. These are women who are not going to be satisfied with the simple things. So, she says, we receive our final education from the men. I'm also reminded of, 19th century India, where, a lot of the English education, the women received it through, their partners in marriage. So here too, she says that, well, we look towards you, for a certain kind of worldly wise education. But look now, she says, at what you do with us. It's this sentiment of being abandoned. So she says, I'll speak of young girls who dwell in dull places. And, she says there are many such places in Russia. So she's also being privileged, but she's talking about the ordinary women who dwell in dull places. And she says her education is finished, she's beginning to live, But amusement is not enough for her, and she dreams of love, but always of love alone. Why? Because, whatever she's reading, again, I'm reminded of Emma Bovary in Madame Bovary, the novel by Flaubert, that, what she's reading is always about love. So she looks towards, the man for this kind of love. So these first moments of hope, of love, of bliss, they are always followed by parting, that there is going to be a separation. So she says, and to quote Maria, she says that, when the woman is left alone, then she learns the sweetness of solitude, which is not, she says, it's not sterile, it's filled with memories and thoughts. And then will she learn to know herself? Will she come to know herself? Will she grow strong? And at that point of time in mid-19th century Russia, because love and marriage are two very important aspects of the woman's life. So, the separation, what is the impact on the woman's mind? So, she says in her own life, she probably expressed her mind fully. But she says here is the difference between the man and the woman. The man, like the story with Akulina, that is the rendezvous, he just goes away and abandons her. And so she says here too, Maria says that it means nothing to a man to begin a new life. A woman cannot do that. She cannot cast aside her past. She cannot tear herself away from her roots. No, 1,000 times no. And this is where what she's, we might not like it, we might not agree with it, but this is the kind of social boundary within which the women are placed. And the very fact that Turgenev is able to see this and his women characters are articulating it, I think it gives us an important point of entry into discussing this. And after this, of course, Alexei says that, well, the women should not give up on their goodness, however pathetic the men might be. So here again, this not tearing away from the past and, not having any options. So what do you think about this in the context of, mid-19th century Russia?
One thing that struck me was that perhaps these people, the characters that are captured by Turgenev, these characters are kind of feminist bias that is guiding them. But now I realize that Turgenev might have been thinking of the similarity between the poor people in general and the women in particular, and that the two are classed together, and then they find that perhaps the education, perhaps manners, perhaps the head, as you say, no, not the body, but the head is important, and that head actually puts women in that category where they are all the time weak, they are uncertain, and they want not marriage, they want love. And if love doesn't happen, then of course marriage is totally, a strangling kind of an experience for women and authority for the men. So maybe it's that kind of socialist concern that the person is showing, and that makes him a realist, as you began with.
Yes, and also somewhere there is also this sense that probably the options that the women have are going to be minimized greatly after this relationship.
Hmm.
And whereas the men, might move on, and the women, really speaking, don't have any option. In fact, she says that because she's a thinking person, so her neighbor refers to her as a female philosopher in a very pejorative sort of manner.
Hmm.
And this, really speaking, tells us. So I think Turgenev, in terms of his short stories, be it his sketches of the peasants, be it sketches of the women, is able to show the women, depict the women characters in terms of their limitations,
Hmm.
and also the male characters. And we are talking in terms of polarities here, of course, but the society was, structured in that manner. So, and how, it was with patriarchy allowed the men to just move on, whereas it limited and confined the women to these spaces.
So friends, we had a good discussion from Professor Payal Nagpal about the two stories that she picked up. They were short in description, but they were very good in terms of depth, in terms of sensitivity, and that kept the two women who were focused in these stories apart from the rest of society. So with these words, we come to the end of the discussion, and I hope viewers that you would have enjoyed this kind of a sophisticated writer that Russia had in the 19th century. And if there is time, you should pick up things from him and read him as a writer of inspiration and of significance. Thank you.